Hello and welcome to today's webinar on optimizing clinical trials with ePRO. Next slide, please. Well, before we start, you can listen to this webinar in English or Japanese. So just choose the language that you want by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and choosing whether you want to listen in Japanese or English. Next slide, please. My name is Bill Byram. I'm Vice President at Signant Health and a Principal of eCOA Science. I've worked in our industry for over 30 years, with the last 15 years in patient-reported outcomes. I'm pleased to be joined by Tempei Miyagi, who's founder of Meaningful Outcome Consulting based in Tokyo. Tempei-san and I have collaborated together on the Japanese translation of my industry textbook on ePRO. And some of this book we'll review on today's webinar. Next slide, please. So before we start, just a few housekeeping points. Please do ask questions and ask them by typing into the Q&A box. You'll see this at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's webinar, but also please answer our end of event survey. We're always looking for ways to improve our events, and so your feedback will be valuable to us. Thank you. Next slide, please. So on today's webinar, Tempei will talk about the output of the Japanese Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare Scientific Research Group projects on patient-reported outcomes. He'll then talk about the development of PRO recommendations for Japan. And I'll then speak about the importance of collecting patient-reported outcomes, the benefits of electronic collection, and then finish by looking at some ePRO hot topics. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Tempei, I wanted to just share a few slides about Signant Health in case you're not familiar with us. We've been collecting clinical outcome assessment data for over 20 years, and our company was made by bringing together two industry eCOA leaders, CRF Health, who are leaders in patient-reported outcomes, and Bracket Global, who are leaders in clinician-reported outcomes, ClinROs. And we became Signant Health in 2019. Next slide, please. As you can see on this slide, we offer solutions and services beyond eCOA, and these include EDC, randomization and trial supply management, electronic informed consent, telemedicine, amongst others. Next slide, please. And in our 20 years, we've supported over 12,000 clinical trials across all study phases and therapy areas. We operate globally and have conducted studies in 135 countries, including Japan, and have provided solutions in 80 different languages. Next slide, please. Finally, we're proud to have supported 28% of novel drug approvals in the US and the EU since 2016. Next slide, please. Now let me hand over to Tempei, who will talk about the scientific research group work, and I'm going to translate what Tempei is saying into English. So please listen to him in either English or Japanese. Tempei, over to you. So Tempei is just explaining that his name is Tempei Miyagi from Meaningful Outcome Consulting. He'd like to introduce some of the trends in PRO research activities in Japan. And within ISPOR, there's a Japanese special interest group that translates guidelines published by ISAQOL. And he discusses the revitalization of PRO research in Japan. QOL PRO is a domestic study group that regularly organizes seminars and scientific meetings. And then the CSP HOR PRO QOL is the PRO QOL consortium organized by the Public Health Research Centre's Health Outcomes Research Programme. And this is mainly engaged in promoting Japanese language versions of instruments and disseminating of instruments such as the PRO CTCAE and the PROMIS instruments in Japan. And the JASCC PRO working group and the JCOG are concerned with the use of PROs in oncology research and practice in Japan. And the JCOG publishes its research policy in both English and Japanese. Tenpei Miyagi is a member of these two oncology organizations, as well as his involvement in some of the working groups you'll hear about in a moment. So I'm just waiting for him to advance to the next slide, so bear with me. Here we are. So in addition to those organised PRO research groups that we've heard about on the last slide, there are often public calls for PRO research projects under the Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare's Scientific Research Fund. And most recently, there have been 3 PRO research groups launched as 3-year projects that started back in April 2020. And Tenpei Miyagi has participated in these as a researcher. So the 3 are listed here on this slide. So the first is headed by Professor Yamaguchi of Tohoku University. And it's a research group evaluating the use of the Japanese version of the Pro-CTCAE in clinical practice in clinical trials. The second research group is led by Professor Nakajima of Kyoto University and is looking at research contributing to the development of guidelines for the implementation of PROs. And then finally, the third group is led by Professor Shimazuma and is exploring the development of PRO guidelines in collaboration with related academic societies. And as we move into the next slides, the next slides will summarize some of that research. Again, just waiting for the next slide. Here we are. So, as you heard in the previous slide, some of the activity is around the use of PROs in routine care, and so in that field, particularly in the routine care for cancer care, there are ongoing efforts to implement systems for monitoring cancer patients using electronic patient-reported outcomes in Japan. And this table shows clinical studies investigating the feasibility and the effectiveness of remote symptom monitoring using ePRO, using the Pro-CTCAE instrument. Sorry. So in addition to oncology, the efficacy of the Pro-CTCAE and ePRO is also being investigated in HIV infections and in lupus. And if you look at this, the 6 projects there, with the exception of the PRO MOTE study, a top one, these are all being planned and conducted by Professor Yamaguchi's group. Great. So this next slide shows the results of a survey of Japanese cancer hospitals that was conducted by Professor Nakajima's group in 2021. And it shows that at present, there are actually very few medical institutions in Japan that have been implementing ePRO into their daily medical care and their routine monitoring of patients. Great. And based on the results of the survey of cancer hospitals, the Nakajima Group has prepared and released a proposal to promote the implementation of patient-reported outcomes in routine cancer care in Japan. And this consists of 5 recommendations that you can see on this slide. So the first is, in cancer treatment, symptom monitoring using PROs should be conducted for all patients. The second recommendation is to establish a foundation for collecting PROs digitally. The third recommendation is to develop a system to ensure that PROs are reliably fed back to healthcare providers. The fourth is that for the elderly to consider paper-based symptom reporting in addition to ePRO, especially when the burden of the patient themselves or their supporting family and healthcare providers is significant. And then the fifth recommendation is to calculate medical fees for symptom monitoring using ePRO. So some really interesting recommendations there around the practical implementation of ePRO in routine care for monitoring patients with cancer. Great. So Professor Shimazuma's group have developed a website, a dedicated page that you can see here on this slide that summarizes the PRO research products that the group have produced. So it summarizes the guidelines and the translations that they've created, and it was created with the cooperation of Life Science Publishing. And all the translated materials that they make available through the web page are available to the public free of charge. And Professor Shimazuma's group, as part of that project of translating, have also developed and published 2 main sets of guidance. So the first is guidance on the use of PROs for clinical trials, and the second is guidance on the use of patient-reported outcomes for clinical practice. Other materials listed here include a preliminary survey for the development of PRO usage guidelines, recommendations on how the PRO CTCAE results should be presented, some recommendations on qualitative research in PRO development, some information and materials on response shift, and finally, Japanese translations of selected key works in the field, in the PRO research field. And some of the key works that have been translated by Professor Shimazuma's group are listed here, and they include, the FDA's COA compendium, and then works looking at measure selection, such as the COSMIN and the ISPOR reports. They also translated Isoqual's PRO ethics guidelines, and some of the work from Mel Calvert and colleagues on the ePRO standards for PRO inclusion in protocols, and also the Consort Pro standards for PRO reporting. And finally, on this slide, they've translated the CISAQOL report on statistical analysis recommendations as it applies to PRO data. And then finally, today's main topic, the ePRO implementation handbook that I wrote with Willie Mulhausen, and that's been translated by members of Professor Shimazuma's group as part of that grant from the government. And Dr. Byron, myself, I'm going to introduce the contents of the handbook in a few minutes. And from Tempe, that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Well, thank you, Tempe-san. Let's now look at the importance of patient-reported outcomes and capturing the voice of the patient in clinical trials. Next slide, please. There's more detail on the importance of patient-reported outcomes and the history of how this developed in the first chapter of my book. I'll cover some of the highlights here in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So first, what is a patient-reported outcome? The FDA defined a patient-reported outcome as any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient without interpretation by a clinician or anyone else. Next slide, please. So while we can measure many different concepts using patient-reported outcomes, there are in fact some aspects of health that can only be known to the patient themselves. So for example, pain, fatigue, nausea. Next slide, please. Dr. Bengt-Erik Wiholm was head of pharmacoepidemiology at the Swedish Medical Products Agency. And in 2003, he famously said, if you want to know what's happening to the patients, why not ask them? Next slide, please. As early as the 1980s, we started to recognize the importance of the patient's view in monitoring the quality of medical outcomes. We began to argue that the goal of medical care for most patients is the achievement of a more effective life and preservation of functioning and well-being. The patient is the best source of this information, and so we began to collect patient experience data to measure this. As a result, some important studies began to demonstrate the usefulness of using standardized health surveys, two of which I briefly describe here. Kruger and colleagues used a structured patient interview to assess quality of life in patients treated for hypertension, and they were able to show that one treatment, captopril, was associated with significantly higher measures of general well-being, fewer side effects, better work performance, and improved life satisfaction than the other treatment studies. A second study by Bombardier and colleagues used a written questionnaire to assess quality of life in rheumatoid arthritis patients. They were able to show differences between the treatments in certain aspects of functioning. Next slide, please. At the same time, the medical outcomes study commenced in the USA in 1981. This was a 4-year longitudinal observational study in over 23,000 patients. And this study tested the large-scale feasibility of self-administered questionnaires and generic health scales for chronic conditions. In 1990, the medical outcomes study questionnaire formed the basis for the first version of the SF-36 quality of life measure that we know today. Next slide. And this brings us closer to today. And Janet Woodcock, the recently retired Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA, said in 2015, it turns out that what is really bothering the patient and what is really bothering the doctor can be radically different things. Patients are true experts in their disease. Next slide, please. So now we see that patient-reported outcomes, we see patient-reported outcomes referenced in disease-specific regulatory guidance documents like migraine and asthma guidances, and of course in the FDA's patient-focused drug development guidance series. And not just the FDA have been underlining the importance of patient-reported outcomes in clinical development. China's Center for Drug Evaluation released draft guidance on patient-reported outcomes in 2021. And Tenpei-san has already discussed some of the work being done in the development of recommendations and guidance for Japan. Next slide, please. So when we implement patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials, one of the first decisions we face is whether to collect the data on paper or whether to use ePRO. So let's look at some of the benefits of electronic collection. Next slide, please. So again, I covered this topic in chapter 2 of my book, but present some of the highlights in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So collecting PRO data on paper is associated with reduced data quality and integrity, and the inability to review data between clinic visits. Paper is also associated with hidden costs that are not always recognized when comparing to the cost of ePRO. We'll explore these in the next slides. Next slide, please. First, data quality and integrity. Here's a typical paper diary card that might be provided to a patient for completion at home. And it illustrates some of the data quality issues that we typically experience using paper diaries. So first, on the right there, missing data. The patient hasn't recorded the date for this report. Second, the possibility of ambiguous data. It's not clear in this case whether the patient is ticked moderate pain or severe pain. Third, we see conflicting data. The patient has said they did not wake up in the night due to their pain, but also recorded that they woke up 3 times because of their pain. And then finally, we see extraneous data written onto the diary itself. Sometimes these are reminders or shopping lists. And in this case, we see the patient has written that they have a headache and a sore throat. So this could be an adverse event. The data management team will need to decide what to do with this extraneous data. Electronic solutions eliminate these problems. They contain inbuilt logic and error checks that enable us to drive clean data. If we go to the next slide. Another important weakness of paper diaries was illustrated in a study by Stone and colleagues that was published in the British Medical Journal over 20 years ago now, in 2002. They asked 80 patients with chronic pain to complete a diary for 3 weeks. What the patient didn't know was that the diary booklet contained a hidden light-sensitive chip, and that could detect when the diary was opened and when it was closed. So when they looked at the apparent compliance with the paper diary, it was 90%. So 90% of days had a diary entry recorded. But when they compared this to the opening and closing of the paper diary, it was only 11% of the days were recorded in the required time interval. So in fact, 36% of days indicated that the diary had not been opened, and yet almost all of those days, 96%, had a diary entry recorded. Even worse than this, 2 patients opened the diary at the start of the 3 weeks, completed all 21 days ahead of time, and then didn't open it again. So these observations undermine the integrity of paper diaries. For reliable patient reports, we need them to be completed at the right time points, so we're not relying on lengthy recall periods that may introduce inaccurate data. Next slide, please. The FDA referenced this phenomenon in their 2009 PRO guidance. In this, they refer to the parking lot effect, the idea that the patient might fill in missing parts of their diary in the parking lot ahead of a clinic visit. They state in the guidance, if a patient diary or some other form of unsupervised data entry is used, we plan to review the clinical trial protocol to determine what steps are taken to ensure that patients make entries according to the clinical trial design and not, for example, just before a clinic visit when the reports will be collected. Next slide, please. So in addition to improvements in data quality and integrity, collecting data electronically can make it possible to provide real-time reports of the PRO data. So this means investigators can access this data between clinic visits and enables better remote monitoring of patients. It also enables the assessment of PRO completion rates throughout the study to ensure that the site can be made aware of any patients who've stopped entering diary data. This way, they can provide proactive follow-up to encourage the patient to continue completing the PRO data or to troubleshoot any difficulties they may be having. Next slide. And finally, completing PRO data on paper comes with hidden costs that are often not accounted for when considering whether to use paper or ePRO. There's the design and printing and shipment of the paper diary materials. There's the need for data to be transcribed, either by the data management team or by the study site themselves. If using a visual analog scale, this will involve manual measurement of the score using a ruler. And there'll be the need for source data verification for the transcribed data. There'll be the need to raise and manage and resolve data queries, which may be hard for study sites to respond to accurately. Paper source records will need careful return and storage, including archiving at the end of the study. So overall, ePRO is associated with greater data quality and integrity, the ability to enhance remote monitoring of patients, and while perceived to be more expensive than paper, there are many hidden costs associated with paper collection of PRO data. Next slide, please. So in this final section, I'll briefly look at a few ePRO hot topics. Next slide, please. The topics are listed here, but if you have some other topics you're interested in, please do ask about them in using the Q&A button. I'll look at measurement comparability, bring your own device or BYOD, ways to limit missing data, current thinking about making changes to PRO data, and a common question we often get asked, whether a visual analog scale needs to be 10 centimeters in length. Next slide, please. So first, measurement comparability. Next slide. Why is measurement comparability important? Well, because many patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs, were developed and validated as paper instruments, care needs to be taken when migrating them to electronic formats to make sure that their original measurement properties are unchanged. Next slide, please. So when we move a measure from paper to electronic, we change the look and the feel of the measure and some of the instructional text. And it's important that these changes don't cause patients to answer the questions differently. So here's an example using the SF36 quality of life measure. You'll see that we've changed the instructional text, telling patients to select a response rather than checking a response on the paper. But more importantly, we've displayed the questions as a single question per page to ensure that they fit well on a smartphone screen. And more significantly, we've changed the verbal response scale from a horizontal list to a vertical list of options. Go to the next slide, please. Over the last 2 decades, we've accumulated a lot of evidence to show that when you migrate a measure from a validated paper questionnaire to an electronic format, like we've just seen for the SF36, there's no change to the measurement properties of the instruments. This evidence includes 2 large meta-analyses of equivalent studies between paper and electronic formats, reported by Chad Waltney and Willie Mulhausen. I also performed a synthesis of over 40 qualitative interview studies looking at equivalence of paper and electronic measures. And further, we've explored the equivalence of paper and electronic formats when BYOD is used, and patients use devices with screens of different sizes and different screen resolutions. and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. So overall, we have a very large body of evidence supporting the comparability of paper and ePRO, covering many different measures and many different patient populations. Next slide, please. And this has been reflected by the revised 2023 ePRO task force recommendations, of which I was a member. And in this task force, we conclude, in the light of the studies that have been performed in the past, further testing of measurement comparability among data collection modes is unnecessary where ePRO best practice implementation standards have been applied. Next slide, please. And ePRO implementation best practices are comprehensively covered in Chapter 3 of my book, but have also been detailed by the Critical Path Institute's eCOA consortium recently, and you see that there on the right-hand side of that slide. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about BYOD, the second topic. Can you go to the next slide, please? We're seeing a steady increase in the number of studies using BYOD instead of providing a study device to all patients. We believe that many patients using their own device brings additional convenience. They don't have to carry a second device and keep it charged. BYOD is also associated with reduced costs and simplified trial logistics, so having to purchase and ship fewer devices around the world. However, we don't eliminate that completely. In BYOD studies, we always provide some provision devices to make sure that patients who are unable or unwilling to use their own device are not excluded from participating. Next slide. There are a number of questions that sponsors often ask when considering BYOD. Is there measurement comparability across different device screen sizes and resolutions? We've sort of talked about that already. Have regulators accepted BYOD data? And is BYOD associated with more missing data and less secure data? We're going to look at these questions briefly now. Next slide, please. So when it comes to measurement comparability across device sizes, I conducted an equivalent study in 2018 comparing BYOD to paper and to a provision device. This was a study in 156 chronic pain patients. They completed a patient-reported outcome measure 3 times in a random order, separated by a washout period. And we chose a measure containing the 3 common response scale types: the verbal response scale, the numeric response scale, and a visual analog scale. And that was so that we could ensure that the results could generalize to most instruments that we might use in future. And next slide, please. In fact, most instruments are made up of these 3 response scale types, and you can see examples of them here. A verbal response scale provides a list of verbal descriptions for each response category, which are ordered in some logical way, in this case from best to worst. A numeric response scale asks the patients to score themselves on a number scale often from 0 to 10 or from 0 to 7. And a visual analog scale asks the patient to mark themselves on a horizontal line, in this case going from no pain on the left to the worst possible pain on the right. And the vast majority of patient-reported outcome measures use these 3 scale types. Next slide, please. So going back to my study, we found that the scores that patients provided using BYOD were equivalent to those provided when they used a provision device and when they used paper. And further, the 3 response scale types were equivalent across these 3 formats, with very high correlations measured by the ICC values. So this study and others give us confidence that the small changes in formatting of PROs across different screen shapes and sizes doesn't add additional variability to the scores or affect the measurement properties of the instruments when we use BYOD. Next slide, please. So let's look at the second question of regulatory acceptance. We're aware that many studies using BYOD where data are collected as primary and secondary study endpoints. However, regulators don't always say when they've received and reviewed data collected using BYOD. In the case of the COVID vaccine work that Signet Health supported, this was collected using BYOD, where the diary data were the primary safety data. and this resulted in successful approvals across the world. And while this case is an unusual circumstances, it does give us a positive signal to the acceptability of BYOD data by regulatory bodies. Next slide, please. So thinking finally about the security and missing data, the EMA has developed specific draft guidance around the use of BYOD, which is another positive signal. And some of this relates to data security and the importance that access to the app is not governed only by the screen lock on the smartphone, but that the ePRO app itself should also require the patient to authenticate to enable it to be opened and accessed. Next slide, please. We also get the question whether BYOD may be associated with more missing data than when using a provision device. Some of this is because with BYOD, patients can turn off in-app notifications and reminders, as they can for any app on their own smartphone. And there's a concern that this could lead to more missing data. But we actually have no evidence of this, and typically when we compare the completion rates of patients using BYOD and provision devices in the same study, they're the same. If anything, a percentage point in favour of BYOD, but not statistically significant. So we don't see any reduction in diary completion rates when using BYOD. Next slide. As I discussed earlier, it's important to provide a device for patients unable or unwilling to use their own when collecting PRO data using BYOD. We see a large variation in the uptake of BYOD across different countries. And you can see this in the blue bars on this graph. This isn't reflected by the market penetration rates of smartphones in these countries, and that's shown by the orange bars in this graph. So there are cultural and other factors that influence BYOD uptake. And you can see that we have, for example, very low use of BYOD in countries like the Philippines and Thailand, and very high use of BYOD in places like Denmark and Taiwan. Uptake in Japan is actually one of the highest in our experience. You see there 91%. Next slide, please. I'll very briefly touch on the other three hot topics before we get to our Q&A. So first, how to limit missing data when using an electronic solution. Next slide, please. Electronic solutions have the advantage that they're able to provide reminders to the patient when it's time to record data, such as an audible alarm or an in-app notification. And when patient completion rates fall to a certain level, an automated email can be sent to the study site to ask them to contact the patient to encourage their ongoing completion. Further, real-time completion reports can be used by the CRAs to follow up with study sites and ask them to contact specific patients if compliance falls too low. In these ways, we can proactively drive good completion rates and complete data sets. Next slide, please. Another hot topic is whether changes to ePRO data should be allowed. Next slide. Well, as defined in GCP, the investigator is ultimately responsible for the accuracy of all source data, and this includes ePRO data. There are occasions when a patient may explain to the investigator that they've made a mistake on their ePRO. For example, they thought a score of 1 represented the worst pain, and actually it should have been a score of 10. Because of this, there are times when accepting data changes makes sense. At other times, it may be less appropriate to make a change to the original data. For example, if a patient reviewing their diary with the investigator decides that their headache 4 weeks ago was not as severe as they had rated it at the time, in this case, we might question how reliably they could remember this. So for this reason, it's important to be able to discuss planned data changes with the investigator, but to comply with GCP, it's important that the sponsor does not control the final decision. So we recommend a data change process in line with the eClinical Forum article that you can see here on the right. In this, we enable a review step before changes are made, but ensure that the investigator maintains the overall control and decision making. Next slide, please. And finally, one hot topic that we're often asked about is, does it matter if a visual analog scale is less than 10 centimeters when represented on a smartphone or a tablet screen? Next slide, please. The traditional paper visual analog scale is 10 centimeters. As this simplifies scoring, we can use a metric ruler to derive a score from 0 to 100 based on the number of millimeters that the mark appears along the scale. With ePRO, the visual analog scale line is often much shorter, as you can see in this example. The question is, does it matter? Next slide, please. In fact, we've seen visual analog scale lines as short as 2.1 centimeters. The question is, does it affect the measurement properties of the scale compared to the traditional 10 centimeter line? Next slide. In my article with the eCOA consortium, we reviewed 23 studies that compared 10 centimeter visual analog scales presented on paper to electronic versions varying from 2.1 centimeters to 20 centimeters in length. We found that electronic and paper versions were comparable regardless of the length. And so when we implement a scale that uses a visual analog scale, we should not be worried about using a slightly shorter line to fit on a smartphone screen. Next slide. So in conclusion, next slide, please. We've seen there is a growing interest in the importance of patient-reported outcomes data in clinical trials in Japan and globally. Tempei-san has shown us that there are already recommended best practices for Japanese researchers available. And we've seen that ePRO is associated with better data quality and integrity compared to paper data collection. We can migrate standard validated PROMs from paper to electronic without the need to generate new evidence or measurement comparability data. And this applies to when we reduce the length of a visual analog scale to less than 10 centimeters. And finally, there continues to be a growing interest and acceptance of BYOD ePRO. So next slide, please. So thank you very much. And we'll now move to our Q&A session. So back to you, my colleagues in Japan.
宮地先生、ご説明ありがとうございました。それではQA セッションの方に移りたいと思います。まず、あらかじめ、いただいたご質問について、1に回答したいと、思います。まず、ePRO の回答を面倒と感じる被験者様が少なからずいるかと思いますが、ePRO の対応を忘れずに確実に実施するために取り組んでいることは何ですかというご質問をいただきました。こちらセッションの方でもご説明がありましたけれども、デバイス自体に、端末自体にアラームやリマインド機能がついておりまして、患者にデータの入力期限が来たら、データを入力してくださいというお知らせを、することができます。また、データはリアルタイムで、ポータルでモニタリングが可能なため、治験実施医療機関の、皆様は、患者のデータ入力状況を確認し、適宜でフォローアップをすることで、データ入力率と、データセットの関数率を向上するということが、できます。はい。もう一つあらかじめ、いただいた、ご質問に回答したいと思います。eCOA データと、インベスティゲーターレビューおよびシグネチャーについて考えを教えてくださいというところですね。こちらもセッションの方で説明ありました通り、ePRO のデータは紙のデータ収集に比べて、より優れたデータ品質と完全性を伴っているということが分かっております。データはリアルタイムにリモートでレビューすることもできるため、紙収集に比べてコストも安くデータ収集することが可能になっております。はい、続きまして、それでは、他に、ちょっと待ってください。QA のところに、ご質問いただいているかと思います。紙プロと ePRO データが混在することは推奨されないでしょうか。国際試験などで国によって ePRO の体制が整っておらず、ある国では ePRO、別の国では紙プロとなるようなことがあった場合、どちらの評価に統一しなければいけないでしょうか。 関口さん、こちら、ちょっとビルに確認してもらっていいですか？
ごめんなさい。もう一度よろしいですか？
QA ボックスにあります、質問が。
Hi, Bill. This is a question from the audience. So, asking whether it's recommended or not recommended mixture of paper-based pro and also ePRO. For example, global studies, some countries probably not ready for ePRO. So, but some other country probably using ePRO, but those countries not ready for ePROs using paper-based pro. Then, with the question is whether those should be used the same paper-based or ePRO, what that could be mixed ePRO and paper-based.
Yeah, so thank you. I don't think there's a problem with mixing them when we think about measurement comparability, because we've already shown that paper and electronic are the same in terms of measurement properties. So we don't have an issue there. I think with paper, when it comes to unsupervised use, so if we've got a paper diary being used at home, for example, I would be reluctant to use paper. We find that we've used ePRO in over 100 different countries. So I don't think there are particular country issues. There may be some issues with some populations that we need to think about, but in general, I prefer not to mix paper and electronic just because of the data quality issues with paper data.
Thank you, Bill. 結論から申しますと、紙のプロと e プロが混ざることに関して特に問題はないというふうには思いますけれども、e プロが使えないようなところというのはなかなかないのではないかというところと、そのビルのプレゼンでもございましたけれども、クオリティのことなどを考えますと、できれば、e プロの方に統一して使った方がよろしいのではないかという回答でございました。ありがとうございます。Thank you, Bill.
その他に、ご質問ございませんでしょうか？ご質問ありがとうございます。関口さん、もう一問、QA ボックスにあります。
Bill, the another question from the audience, it's about VAS, and then also you mentioned BOYD and also companies providing device no result difference. But question is whether the size, the scale is synchronized with BOYD or other device provided the companies. If that is not unified, I mean, BY or BOYD and also provided device, how do you think? Is that no problem, or you find any issues for us?
Interesting. Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think the study that I showed you, the BYOD equivalent study, the one that I performed, we looked at the visual analog scale on a provision device. So it was a fixed length on for every patient. And then we looked at it on their own device, which was variable depending on the size of the device that they used. And so we found that there was no difference. And since then, the Critical Path Institute, ECOA Consortium, have done an equivalent study as well and shown similar results. And so I think there's nothing to worry about when we use BYOD, even for visual analog scale, even that the length will be slightly different between devices. I think we have enough evidence to support that it would be equivalent.
ご質問ありがとうございました。ご質問いただいた通り、確かにデバイスによってはそのバスのサイズが変わってきてしまうということはあると思います。ただし、サイズが変わってきたとしまいましても、その評価に関しましては統一できているというふうに考えております。クリティカルパスインスティテュートのそのリサーチなどによりましても、その評価スケールのサイズが仮に長さが違ったとしても、その結果に関しては統一性が持たれているということでございましたので、 そのような違いがあったとしても問題ないという回答でございます。ありがとうございます。Thank you, Bill.
はい。そうしましたら、もう一つ、もう二つ質問ありますけれども、私の方で回答したいと思います。ご質問は、治験のような臨床試験において、ePRO の5データの訂正については、データの修正可能条件や修正手順を定めておくことで可能となるという認識でよろしいでしょうかというご質問ですけれども、こちらの、ePRO のデータ修正に関しましては、DCF というデータクラリフィケーションフォームという機能がございまして、そちらを、トライアルマネージャー上でリクエスト上げることによって、弊社のデータマネージャーの方で承認して、データ修正をするという、プロセス、手順になっているんですけれども、あらかじめデータの修正、可能な条件や手順というのは、ご指摘の通り、定めていて、事前に定めた方法で、データ修正の方を進めていくという手順になっております。はい。で、もう一つ、ePRO の入力が本人であることを証明はどうしているのでしょうか。また、入力ごとに行う必要があるのでしょうかというご質問ですけれども、こちらは、デバイスに、ログインするときに、ピン番号という、あらかじめ、被験者様の登録した、番号で、ログインしてデータ収集、入力を進めていくので、こちらは、入力ごとに、入力ごとというか、デバイスを起動したごとに、行う作業になります。はい、それで、本人の証明ができます。はい、その他に、ご質問ございますでしょうか。はい、ありがとうございます。そうしましたら、Hey, Bill, do you have any other comment or a message?
No, but I just wanted to thank everybody for joining. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope it's been an interesting day. And of course, the team here are really happy to answer any more questions after the event. If you'd like to contact us, our contact details are on this slide. So back to you, Tetsu, and thank you very much, everybody. It's been a lovely time to speak with you.
ありがとうございます。そうしましたら、そろそろ終了の時間となります。本日はお忙しいところ、ウェビナーにご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。eCOA により興味を持っていただければ幸いです。また、このトピックに関して、質問がある場合には、スライドに記載される電子メールアドレスを使用して、お気軽にお問い合わせいただければと思います。本日はお忙しいところ、ウェビナーにご参加いただきまして、誠にありがとうございました。